Today, the title of the presentation is Steering Old Ashes. As you know, my email is fguevara@arquetopia.org. It's on the upper right part of the screen, and you can always contact me with any questions that you might have. And I always begin with the land acknowledgement that we have at Arquetopia. And we acknowledge that all of our artist residencies are located on historical lands that over the centuries have been continuously defended from the greed and invasion of multiple empires, including the Hispanic monarchy, the First French Empire, the British Empire, and the Mexican-American War. We recognize that our work is only possible because of the multiple histories of resistance and contestations that intersect in Mexico and Peru, including each and every one of you. Through our mission, we continuously acknowledge the voices of those who have been historically unheard, seeking to address the violence and injustices of settler colonialism and imperialism, knowing that envisioning justice is only possible in the anti-colonial way. We're going to be thinking, what does it mean to engage with an anti-colonial way of being, seeing, producing, thinking, etc. This acknowledgement is not metaphor. It's not metaphorical, but rather an active engagement in which all of our artists in residence are included. It is the first step to honor the land, the wisdom to love and respect the people that inhabit Mexico, Peru, and of course in each one of you in your countries, in your communities. And this program, Echoes of the Unseen in the Art Practice, will focus on the notion of Toltecayotl, which is a Nahuatl term, and it can be translated to the dialogue between head and heart as an expression of intuition or as a manifestation and actualization of intuition, and is designed to delve into the tension between the visible and the invisible by engaging with non-dominant forms of knowledge, ranging from the suppressed voices of the European witch hunts to the resilient epistemologies of indigenous people in the Americas and also other parts of the world. The program orchestrates a crucible where embodied practice transcends inherited canons, foregrounding intuition, ritual, and material experimentation as intricate forms of critical inquiry. So we're going to be thinking about movement. We're going to be thinking about eternity. We're going to be thinking about space and time as relationships in which we engage. Again, if at any point you have any questions, feel free just to open your mic and I can always stop and I can answer any questions or hear thoughts, etc. So this is, as you probably know, an important season here in Mexico. It's a national holiday, but more than that, or it will be, it's not today, but it will be. More than that, I want us to think about ancestors. Ancestors in not only in the family tree genetic way, but actually in relation to our practice, our practices, our positions, where we're actually standing, and our own histories that are intertwined. And this is the title of a lecture that Kirsten Buick gave that I'm also using to contextualize. She mentions ancestors, and this is my definition. I was thinking, how do I convey the method through this idea? So ancestor is a category of survival and insurgent knowledge. Those who moved through domination and, in quotes, did not die, but left techniques, in parentheses, tactics, remember tactics are time-based, of living, loving, and fighting that continue to instruct the present. To call someone ancestor is not only to remember them, but to conscript ourselves into the unfinished labor of their defiance. It is not merely one who came before, but the ethical condition of relation that precedes and exceeds the self. Here I am challenging the Cartesian ideal of the I. I think of ancestor in Levinasian terms, the other, with a capital O, whose face, even when no longer living, commands responsibility and interrupts the fiction of self-sovereignty. Ancestry, therefore, is the priorness of obligation, not only genetics, that structures the subject from outside. An ancestor is therefore both past and future, the archive of what was endured, and the mandate for what must not be repeated, a horizon of militant care where memory becomes method and futurity becomes accountability. And from there, I want to introduce uh, one of the main characters of this story. And this is Helen Duncan. She was born in Callender in 1897. The daughter of a cabinet maker, Helen Duncan was a show woman who traveled throughout Britain holding regular seances during which she would produce the form of dead people by emitting cloud-like substance, ectoplasm, from her mouth. The spirits were said to appear talking and actually touching their relatives. And it was during the years of the Second World War that Duncan's activities attracted the attention of the establishment. In 1941, she spoke with a deceased sailor and revealed that his ship had been sunk in the Mediterranean, although the War Office did not officially release this fact until several months later. On the night of January 19, 1944, one of Helen's seances was raided by police in her then hometown of Portsmouth. Officers attempted to stop the ectoplasm issuing from Helen's mouth, but failed. After some order had been restored, Helen was formally arrested. The real reason for the raid was due to the official paranoia surrounding the forthcoming D-Day, Normandy landing, and the fear that she may reveal the date, location, and other details. In one of the most sensational episodes in wartime Britain, Duncan was eventually brought to trial and became the last person to be prosecuted under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. After a 7-day trial, she was sentenced to 9 months in London's Holloway prison. She was even denied the right to appeal to the House of Lords. As a result of the case, the Witchcraft Acts were finally repealed in 1951. Helen Duncan was released from prison on September 1944. However, the harassment she faced appeared to have continued right up to her death. In November 1956, the police raided a private seance in an attempt to prove fraud. 5 weeks later, the woman who will always be remembered as the last official victim of the witch hunts died. And we need to think about the hunts as they craft the witch. And that's important because it's going to be related. It is related. We're going to see how it is related to the invention of body. So Silvia Federici explains, with the idea why steering old ashes, that there are important structural aspects of the 16th and 17th century witch hunts that still need to be analyzed and placed in the appropriate socio-historical context. Witch hunts serve to deprive women of their medical practices, force them to submit to the patriarchal control of the nuclear family, and destroy the holistic concept of nature that until the Renaissance set limits on the exploitation of the female body, and not only the female body, also the land. Witches were seen as handmaidens of the devil, engaged in a worldwide conspiracy to end human life, and they have to be rooted out. So we have to think about how witch, the term witches, it's a legal situation. More than an insult, more than a derogatory term, we need to understand the legal implications of when someone was accused of witchcraft. In the 1480s, the idea that abortion was an affront to God's plan, but should be stopped in civil court proceedings, began to take hold through the work of German Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer. Kramer faced skepticism from theologians who argued that abortion was a spiritual issue, not one for consideration by secular judges. Still, he plowed forward, eventually earning the support of Pope Innocent VIII, who ensured that anyone opposing witch hunts was excommunicated and tried for heresy. In 1486, as state judicial systems in continental Europe gained power while working intimately with the Catholic Church, Kramer published his ecclesiastical manual, the Malleus Maleficarum. The handbook was meant to streamline legal and investigative procedures for witch hunters. It covered not only abortion, but also infertility, male impotence, stillbirth, and other situations involving botched or delayed human procreation. And as we think about these spaces in which we're going to be generous with each other, sharing our practices, I'm also intersecting some of the work that I have produced through these ideas so that you can also see how I intersect some of the ideas with the theory, the method, the making. So this is one of my paintings. It's based on this specific event with Kramer, the Malleus Maleficarum, the first edition. You can see it with the letters in the background of the portrait, and it has also the map of the manor, which eventually became the design for plantations in the Americas. So from 1581 to 1593, Archbishop Johann von Schronenberg, which is the portrait that, the profile that you see in the painting, operated the Trier witch hunts, not only as a mass murder, eliminating roughly 300 people, including Jews, Protestants, as well as women and children accused of witchcraft, but as a machinery of redistribution. He promised the proceeds of the trials to convince the Jesuits to establish a college and convent in Trier, and the prosecution enabled the seizure of land, incomes, and movable goods that were redirected to that end. Thus, the chief beneficiaries was the Jesuit College itself, which expanded significantly during and immediately after the killings. The Jesuits' growth was materially underwritten by property stripped from the legalized execution and expropriation of women. So we have to take a closer look at the witch hunts. Officially, the witch hunts lasted from the 1300s to 1951. And therefore, the witch hunt is an aspect of the great transformation that led to the establishment of capitalism in Europe. What has remained unacknowledged is that, like the slave trade and the extermination of the indigenous populations in the so called New World, the witch hunt stands as a crossroads of a cluster of social processes that paved the way for the rise of modern capitalist world. And one of the important aspects that we need to think about, if you remember from one of the essays in the residency by Ramon Grossfogel, he makes the links between these different historical events of extermination, the Al-Andalus and Jews being exterminated in the Iberian Peninsula with the invasion and the so-called conquest in the Americas, as well as the enslavement of human beings that became the transatlantic slave trade with the witch hunts. But something important to think about these events is that the longest process of extermination we have endured have been the witch hunts. And this is important to think about because the witch hunts are very, very different from other processes of extermination. For instance, the so-called witches didn't have cities, didn't have long extensions of territories or resources or troves of treasures that could be compared to the reasoning or the excuse behind the invasion of the Americas. When we think about the Americas and El Dorado, the legend of seeking gold, etc., the witch hunts were very, very different. I'm going to show you this next slide, which is showing a graph of how the witch hunts took place. And you can see how the different colors, the different shades of purple, the darkest are trials ended with execution. The middle one are trials that ended with no death sentence. And the lightest would be trials with unknown outcome. And we can see from the 1300s how these historical events that are associated with land and property begin these curve in executions. So first you have the Hundred Years' War, then you also have the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in between the 1400s and the 1500s. Then you have the Protestant Reformation, the 30 Years' War, which is a consequence of the Reformation, and of course the spread of Illuminism. And then I extended the graph all the way to World War II. We can see where Helen Duncan's trial actually happened, and that is specifically in England. But also I have added the genocides of the 20th century that are also connected to the witch hunts, because with the extermination of Bosnia and that happened in Bosnia and Rwanda, there's also a rise in these kinds of trials that are still happening today. So this visualization tells the story of witch trials in early modern times until today, while also highlighting how they relate to major historical events. So, and as an example, in the 1980s and 1990s, saw the coexistence of an unprecedented technological development and the return of phenomena that are usually associated with underdevelopment, in quotes, or with the previous age of primitive accumulation, homelessness, the large-scale confinement of Black people in people of color in the nation's jails, specifically to the United States, but also other parts of the world, patterned on the great confinement of the 17th century, widespread illiteracy, the spread of anonymous violence, and a broad pattern of social disintegration. The witch hunt, too, then must be rescued from the isolation of the village and placed in a broader frame. It needs to be examined on a continuum with other events and processes unfolding at both the village and the national level. And from there, we need to understand what does it mean when we think about conflict. And all conflict, whether intimate or imperial, can be traced to the protection of property. This is very important because property becomes a technology, a weapon. Property is not a natural fact, but a technology, as I mentioned, a legal and symbolic apparatus for fixing the boundaries of possession. Its possibility depends on a prior invention, the body as a container of the self and of rights. Once the human is defined as a bounded, ownable unit, the world can be partitioned into what is, in quotes, mine and, in quotes, not mine. Capitalism radicalizes this invention by treating every relation, land, labor, bodies, time, and even silence, as a transferable asset. Under such a regime, conflict is not an accident, but a structural effect, the defense of what is owned against the claims of those excluded. Property thus becomes a grammar through which violence is authorized and rationalized. From domestic disputes to colonial extermination, it is not just an economic category, but the metaphysical hinge on which modern war, law, and inequality turn. And property is actually supported by adverse possession. Power is constituted by the claiming of dominion by adverse possession, and in order to obtain it, there must be a clear intention to exclude the world at large. That is what also property is: exclude the world at large from accessing specific things, objects, etc. Adverse possession is the doctrine under which a person in possession of something owned by someone else may acquire valid title to it so long as certain requirements are met. In the standard settler colonial tradition, adverse possession means taking land without the consent of those who were already there and thereby acquiring title to that land. It remains an active and central part of most law systems worldwide. And this, of course, includes global institutions, organizations like UNESCO, like the UN, these ideas have permeated the whole legal system in which we have to operate today. So, in that sense, sexual atrocities as a form of taking possession without consent is equally applicable to bodily violations of all kinds. And since the 16th century, Europeans have visualized colonialism as rape in every possible form. So, linking it to the Americas, the European witch hunts function as a domestic rehearsal for the logic later exported to the Americas, destroying non-dominant knowledge and it destroyed non-dominant knowledge and redirect material life into the new order. The legal machinery of the trials seized land, tools, pensions, and household wealth and redistributed them to church, state, and compliant male heirs. When colonization crossed the Atlantic, the pattern scaled outward. Local knowledge was captured or branded as idolatry, sources of knowledge and infrastructure were destroyed, and land, labor, and minerals were legally converted into property of the crown, the church, and chartered companies. The Americas were not an epistemic beginning, but a continuation, the same double operation knowledge destruction and property capture. First tested on European women was deployed, which was first tested on European women, was deployed on whole civilizations. So since the 16th century, property has systematically become the underlying rationale that gives order to this world. Rather than ethics, life in itself is the content of ethics. We continuously favor and protect property, becoming both a symbol and a resource. And that's very important because, as we are seeing, through the invention of body and through conflict, we are always protecting property. And the way the world is organized excludes ethics, which at the core of ethics is life. So Gines de Sepúlveda argued in favor of of the position that, in quotes, Indians are, in quotes, people without a soul, and therefore they are animals that could be enslaved in the labor process without being a sin in the eyes of God. Part of his argument to demonstrate the inferiority of the in quotes, Indian below the line of the human was the modern capitalist argument that Indians had no sense of private property and no notion of markets because they produce through collective forms and distribute wealth through reciprocity. And that's the actual reason of why these women, first in the 13, 14, 1500s, etc., were targeted because they were dangerous, because they possessed these notions of collectivity. And then, as the expansion moves into other parts of the world, including the Americas, any kind of knowledge that was based on these forms of collectivity and sharing were actually targeted as well. Property, power, and possession. As W.J.T. Mitchell explains, an empire requires not just a lot of stuff, but what Michel Foucault called an order of things, an epistemic field that produces a sense of the kinds of objects, the logic of their speciation, their taxonomy. Empire always claims objectivity, which is what we have come to learn as universality. Modernity, as a mode of existing in time, was the product of slavery. In that sense, the primary thing, in quotes, being ordered was the, in quotes, slave, becoming property by reconfiguring power through possession. The slave was the first classified by natural history, which created a relevant modality of species, property, then separated from free space by mapping, while the force of law embodied in slave codes that sustain the logic of division, being possession, thereby making it seem right and hence aesthetic, which is power. So, in this sense, what we're seeing is how property becomes the driving rationale, which then becomes naturalized through history. And when we think about slavery, some scholars think of it as an ontological scandal, meaning the impossibility of fully being transformed into a thing, because when we enslave, we actually know that there is a relationship through ethics that cannot be denied. And therefore, it's not that we dehumanize, it's that we find pleasure in these ways of oppressing and actually exterminating. And that is related to the notion of landscape and property. Within the history of landscape representation, property has existed as the underlying rationale for landscape as both symbol and resource. Property is a relation between people for the purpose of something and not a relation between an individual and something. And this is key. Property is a relation between people for the purpose of something and not really the relationship that we establish or that we imagine we establish as individuals with something. And it requires three conditions: a mental connection, the idea that I own something; a physical possession, meaning possessing it and not sharing it; and a purpose with a third, which is key to understand how property is actually enacted since 1492 all the way to today. So we must consider the role that landscape representation plays in the translation of concepts such as identity, citizenship, and belonging, as well as the not there, having not legally defined presence on or right to property, and the nowhere, land that has yet to be commodified, and no one, designated as neither alien nor citizen according to national properties. And this idea is to understand how identity plays a role through property, because we imagine we have the right to something through the invention of borders. And identity is always a problem because it's not really identity, it's identification. So, how we are positioned relative to landscape is how we authenticate identity objects. And that's also related to class, race, gender, etc. And this is from the essay Race as Object Lessons by Kirsten Buick. So, the Humani Corporis Fabrica Libris Septem, published by Andreas Vesalius in 1543, is a foundational work of modern anatomy, breaking from Galentic Galenic tradition. Vesalius based his study on direct human dissection and included detailed illustrations, like from Titian's studio, that revealed the body's structure with unprecedented precision. In Book 2, the famous Muscle Men presents flayed figures set against expansive landscapes, which, when viewed sequentially, form a continuous panorama of the Aegean hills near Padua. From a critical perspective, the Muscle Men panorama can be read as a perverse landscape. The body is mapped like territory. The musculature of each figure poses a topography awaiting survey, conquest, and control. By embedding anatomical subjects in open vistas, Vesalius aligns internal human structure with external terrain, signaling that the body is itself a landscape to be explored, measured, and mastered. In this vision, the anatomical subject is rendered as though it were a conquered realm. Limbs are ridges and tendons are paths, muscles are hills and valleys to be charted. In doing so, the work enshrines a metaphor of mastery that mirrors imperial and scientific ambitions of the area, suggesting that to know the body is to tame it as one tames land. And we're going to see this through the process of how continental philosophy came to dominate all the fields of knowledge that we know today. So, in that sense, the body as a concept is not a universal category. With the arrival of Christianity, the body became a theological and political weapon. Missionaries and imperial authorities used it to impose a regime of moral, racial, and sexual discipline. The, in quotes, body as flesh to be purified, corrected, and saved, This was inseparable from the project of conquest. The colonized body was to be clothed, baptized, normalized, and ultimately owned, just as the land was. By defining the indigenous peoples as bodies, mortal, sinful, and in need of redemption, colonizers translated cosmological difference into hierarchy and possession. So the body, as I was mentioning, as a concept, is not a universal category, but an ideological invention born from specific historical, religious, and philosophical frameworks. In the context of the Americas, the very idea of the body as a discrete, bounded, and individual entity, separable from spirit, land, and community, was introduced through Christianity and European colonialism. It has no equivalent in the cosmologies or language of indigenous people, where existence is typically conceived relationally. Humans are extensions of territory, ancestors, elements, and reciprocal forces rather than self contained organisms. In this context, the invention of body was inseparable from the theological and legal frameworks that justify possession of land, labor, and of life itself. Within Franciscan ideology, the body became a new frontier of colonization, a site to be disciplined, purified, and owned. This is the same text that I was reading before. So these illustrations of monstrous humans by Sebastian Munsters, 1544, is a description of an engraving showing from left to right monopod, sciapod, a female cyclops, conjoined twins, Blemye, and a uh, cyno, cynocephaly. Mhm. So these are some of the images that were actually connected to how we understand body today and how the history of maps are also expanded. So body and images. The body has become a central concern both in academia and in the wider culture, providing one of the few points of direct contact between these often divorced spheres. This is also why we use academic readings to challenge how power gets accumulated in these spaces of power. After the scandal over Robert Mapplethorpe's 1988 exhibition, the rise of new techniques of medical imagining of the body and the dissolution of many of the norms of sexualized identity, the body question continues to gain urgency. Indeed, at all times of social uncertainty, the representation of the body is a key concern. And we can see it today now that we're approaching so many different kinds of wars. The current moment is an amplification of the experience Walter Benjamin perceived in the generation who lived through the First World War. In quotes, a generation that had gone to school on a horse drawn streetcar now stood under the open sky in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds, and beneath those clouds, in a field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, was a tiny, fragile human body. And this is from Nicholas Mirsov, Bodyscapes. So here we have two examples that are 600 years apart. On the left, America by Theodore Gall after Johannes Jordanus' drawing from the Nova Reperta series from the 1600s. And on the right, Vogue Point of View, Ticket to Paradise, photo shoot by Patrick de Marchelier from US Vogue December 2004. And what we have to keep in mind is how a place in the map is a place in history. And physical time is part of a system of ideas which includes space, the invention of bodies, and also motion. So, what is the body? The body is mutable, incomplete, and always in flux. This alarming feeling of instability has led to numerous efforts to control the development of the physical body by promoting certain physical characteristics at the expense of others. Thus, your body is not itself, it is a battleground. It is subject to control through the legacy of the Renaissance, colonialism, and imperialism. The, in quotes, perfect body is now under siege by the pharmaceutical, aerobic, dietetic, liposuctive, calorie-controlled cybernetic world of empire. It is a verb rather than a noun. It is a process rather than a thing. It is a symbol, a resource, and a, in quotes, medium, a system of delivery, communication, a communicating event. It doesn't merely signify or symbolize power relations. And what we need to think about with this statement, that it doesn't merely signify power relations, is that the body is at one the final point of resistance. Well, I'll show that idea. It doesn't merely signify or symbolize power relations, is to convey how when we say, for instance, woman, is not really something stable for everyone, but rather how these power relations invented to situate it with specific functions. So rather than thinking of body, we have to remember it is the final point of resistance of the global imperatives of empire and also the first to be affected by it. And these are conclusions from a conversation that I had with Kirsten Buick in relation to the body and landscape. And this is an important idea to think about it. I replace the idea of body by understanding how it is a point of resistance in which we move. So, in that sense, seeing is never simple. It is not merely a passive reception of visual stimuli, but an active interpretative process, an operating system that structures our understanding of the world. Seeing is shaped by history, culture, memory, and power. It is conditioned by what we have been taught to recognize and what we have been trained to overlook, and that, of course, includes bodies. It is a world making activity where perception is never neutral but always informed by context, ideology, and experience. So, the idea of the voyeur that we can travel and that we can see and we can observe without changing what we're seeing is actually impossible. Just as what we see is constructed, what we do not see, what is ignored, erased, or rendered invisible, is always highly political. Absence is not system that reinforces hierarchies, exclusion, and dominant narratives. Yet, within this absence lies the potential to rupture, for reconfiguring what is possible. So, we're going to think about this space in which we um, can recognize, identify the tension between the visible and the invisible. So what appears within the framework of sight is not merely a product of vision. The visible is an event that occurs between multiple individuals. Vision is inherently personal, yet always interconnected with other forms of perception. The visible is an event that embodied interaction between people, between, in quotes, human and non-human life, between people and media, and between people and machines. And by machines, that includes historical constructs such as plantations, ships, and states. Think about how we are linking this to the notion of property. And this leads to the idea of white sight that Nicholas Mirsov describes and expands as an idea, which I find very, very useful. And what we have to think about is that white is not a racial reality, but a position of power, dependent on imagining a center and structuring experience according to empire. Nicholas Mirsov explains that white sight functions as a key system in the construction of whiteness. It emerged in Renaissance Europe alongside the transition to Atlantic world racial capitalism sustained by slavery and colonialism. To adapt Simone de Beauvoir formula, one is not born, but rather becomes white. It is a learned cultural system, not an innate characteristic. Consequently, and this is very important, no individual alone possesses white sight. It doesn't mean that because we are seen as white or because we identify as white, we possess white sight. In fact, it is a collective structure. Everyone engages with this white sight. Always seeing from above, white sight surveys lands and places all life under surveillance. It operates through interconnected infrastructures. first center on the statutes, meaning laws and state, reinforced by law, and later extended through the imperial screen. Today, that screen has shattered into countless personal devices. Whiteside does not perceive everything. With this, well, I stop right there. Today, that screen has shattered into countless personal devices. This is why we use phones. This is why we're meeting now through a monitor. But Whiteside does not perceive everything. Instead, projects a white reality, enforcing its dominance. Any failure to conform to this imposed reality is corrected with violence. And what is key is to understand how this white side is not reality, it's coded over reality, and therefore we are visible sometimes and we are not visible sometimes. And what we're going to see as well is the concept of living in the dark or existing in the dark, or this possibility of being opaque, obscure, etc. So Imperial Whiteside imposed an imaginary screen between the colonizer and the colonized. British art critic and imperial apologist John Ruskin described how the English viewer should imagine a mile square sheet of glass placed between himself, intentionally gendered, and the subject being depicted, which is what we're seeing here. That's why it's a female sculpture. Rather than relying on the traditional vanishing point of classical perspective, this framework was structured around what Ruskin termed a side point, directing the viewer's gaze. Designed to create both an emotional and cultural barrier, the imperial screen ensured that the viewer remained detached from what was observed. To occupy the imperial position was to embody whiteness, the powerful experience of being the spectator rather than the spectacle. This distance was not a vantage point, it became a site of control and violence, where the separation between observer and observed enabled extreme brutality, both in the colonies and at home. And what we need to think about is how images become flat as we produce them, and therefore, behind the screen that they become, property is always being protected. So empire has positioned itself as an all-seeing force, as I was mentioning, constructing a reality defined by constant surveillance where everything is expected to become a resource, either exploited, killed, or exterminated for profit. Within this system, visibility itself functions as raw material, product, and labor. Every act of seeing serves as raw material, producing forms of control such as surveying, surveillance, and the visualization of data, graphs, maps, and digital photographs. These visual products are structured hierarchically, reinforcing an order that is both unequal and unstable. To sustain this system, it fabricates both the body and the, in quotes, necessary infrastructure, first through the statute, the law, and the state, upheld by laws, again, and later through the imperial screen, which solidifies what is recognized as reality. Whiteside functions as a tool of measurement and control, quantifying stolen indigenous land and enslaved labor in units such as the chain, a measure of approximately 22 yards. A catalog real estate, a term that encompassed both land and the human beings enslaved under the British Empire. More than just a system of perception, Whiteside actively registered, maintained, and administered ownership, reinforcing the structure of colonial domination. And here we see how it is connected to what we are experiencing today. The key distinction between perspective and drone warfare lies in the mediation of a screen between the soldier and the device. The drone, in quotes, sees and transmits its visual data to operators who remain safely distant from the battlefield. Using joysticks modeled after video game controllers, these operators can maneuver multiple drones and determine when and whether to launch an attack. Since 2009, Israel has deployed drones in Gaza for both surveillance and combat missions. The area within a drone's visual range is referred to by operators as the kill box in quotes. A US Army manual outlines, which we're seeing here, procedures of managing this space, including post-strike documentation. However, the term itself is literal. Anything visible within the kill box is a potential target for elimination. White site functions as a tool of measurement, as I was mentioning. And here we see an Israeli real estate company, which is already drawing up plans for settlements in the Gaza Strip. And what you see in the poster reads as follows: a house on the beach is not a dream. The ad reads. Below it says their employees are expelling invaders. And this is what the idea of monohumanism is key to understand what we now understand both as citizen and as human. Sylvia Wynter defines these ways of being in the world as monohumanism. They're grounded in the dominant white and colonial conception of humanity that tends to define human beings primarily through a biological, racial, and hierarchical lens. Monohumanism means that there is only one way to be fully human, which becomes known as whiteness. The human/animal divide is a racial and colonial divide. Concealed by the human/animal opposition is the carnal political question of flesh under the regime of racial capitalism. In the afterlife of slavery, animals are also rendered flesh under the carnal political regimes of racial capitalist valuation. We might read Fanon's statement, in quotes, the terms that Settler uses when he mentions the native are zoological terms, and so end of quote, as positing a colonized/human relation that haunts the ontology and anthropology of the human. This is from the essay Impossibility of That by Eva Hayward and Che Gosset. So here we go back to the central idea of movement rather than body. We have already set the stage to understand how the body is constructed, how it's tied to property, how all of this is tied to the notion of seeing, including white sight. But body, according to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, is a historical idea rather than a natural species. It is an active process of embodying certain cultural and historical possibilities and a specific kind of making present. Because of practices that socially classifies bodies through space and time, ideologies such as race, class, gender, age, etc., are spatialized, learned, legitimated, and perceived as natural, necessary, and inevitable. Thus, our bodies are constantly weaponized, used to make the measurement of such spatial relations possible, forcing us to embody in specific ways. And again, using Simone de Beauvoir's words, the body is a manner of doing, dramatizing, and reproducing historical situations. In quotes, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. However, we are much more than our bodies, or as RuPaul says, we're born naked and the rest is drag. And here I want to introduce one of the core terms that we're going to be thinking about. And it's not that we need to, or we have to, or that we are engaging in cultural appropriation, is to understand that forms of knowledge that were targeted for extermination have a different possibility for us to see the world. It's not really, not fully, it's not really to romanticize these knowledges. Many of them are gone. Pieces of them remain, as some scholars would say or would write about. These are patterns that remain in the ways in which we can engage with certain forms, leftovers, pieces from both periods, and Ixiptla is one of them. So Alfredo Lopez Austin is one of the thinkers that I use to explain some of these ideas, to expand many of these ideas. And he's actually explaining that modern and we are referring to modernity, this idea of existing in time by being able to control it, meaning modern notions of body, in quotes, did not exist in pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica, but also they also didn't exist in the Andean world. He explains that the Nahua worldview did not separate mind, body, and spirit as distinct entities. Instead, the human being was understood as a system of forces or anemic essences in constant exchange with the cosmos, a dynamic rather than a bounded form. This is why Lopez Austin insists that translating terms such as Ishipla as body or representation is misleading. And what we see that I was explaining through the presentation is that as the Franciscans arrive in the Americas, they have a hard time being able to translate two ideas that are central to Christian ideology. First is image. The notion of image is imperial, it's not universal, and therefore they use the term Ishiptla to translate the idea of image because images are powerful. And then art is also translated as Toltecayotl, which we're also going to see. But more than anything, they couldn't find an equivalent term to the notion of body. And the whole ideology, Christian ideology, is based on the notion of lynching the body, on the notion of rape, or the notion of virginity, which are the two extremes in the whole structure of this ideology. So Lopez Austin explains that in Nahuatl, Xiptla referred not simply to a physical vessel, but to the embodied or actualization of a sacred force in a particular form, whether a person, an idol, or a ritual substitute, and more than ritual, a movement. The Xiptla was not an imitation of, but an actualization of divine presence temporarily inhabited by the sacred essence it represented. Meaning, this notion of representation of the idea being supported by a medium is Renaissance. And Shipla is actually challenging that because it cannot be translated as delegate or representative or the husk. I mean, the husk will be addressed in a moment, but it's very different from the notion of representation. It's actualization what matters. Therefore, in the Mesoamerican world, there was no body, in quotes, as an isolated biological object. The human being was and is porous, relational, and cosmological, a node in a web of energies connecting gods, ancestors, animals, and elements, and of course, plants. For Lopez Austin, imposing the European concept of body onto this system distorts indigenous epistemologies, not only distorts but twists them and destroys them, which understood existence through flows and transformation rather than containment. And think about how these notions of transforming these terms in through body become a possibility for property, the commodification of the body being equated to landscape, etc., etc. As I explained, the notion of body didn't exist prior to the so-called conquest. In the Americas, beings and things share the same spirit that fills them up with life. The difference is expressed and defined by the limits of difference. And this is key because as we see how Christianity led or set the stage for the modern notion of knowledge, we see this categorization of beings created through the notion of visual difference or the perception of difference. And in fact, we need to think about how difference is only the difference that difference makes. Difference is the difference that difference makes. So, in this sense, and this is from Kristen Buick, the idea of difference. In this sense, body needs to be understood as some sort of clothing or garment, and the garments or clothes as body. And this is related to the image we're actually looking at. I will address it in a moment. So, Eduardo Viveros Castro notes that it is not possible to distinguish between physiological processes and sociological processes. The transformation of the body, social relations, and the laws that condense them are one and the same. Thus, human nature is literally manufactured or configured by culture. The body is imagined in every possible sense of the word by society. So what we have here on the left is an image that I took from a lecture by Diana Magaloni, and it is a good example to understand how we embody. So we see Kaya po maka boy. It's not a boy dressed as a macaw. It's actually a Kaya po maka boy altogether. And this is to understand how, through the actualization of these ways of moving, we embody. And that is connected to our infinitude, our eternity. This is why rhythms and ways of moving are so key to understand not only our experiences, but our practices. And this is something that we're going to continue to explore throughout the program. So it's rather fiction, also known as non-dominant epistemologies instead of body. And in Shipla, Lopez Austin explains it's the protective deity as the notion of man God. Infinitude is what I was mentioning. It's our our possibility of understanding how we have this divinity, how we're connected to eternity in that sense. And he points out that this word has been mistranslated, translated as image, delegate, replacement, substitute, character, or representative. But as he analyzes its roots, XIP, ship, the shipla, and its relation to other words in Nahuatl, he asserts it corresponds to the idea of skin, covering, or husk, suggesting that the in quotes man god, apart from being the covering, the protection, it is the likeness of the god, the divine in itself. And that's how we need to understand these ways of moving. Moving, how I move in front of you and how you respond to this movement, is the only way to understand how we come from beyond this specific moment, but also how that is linked to to the notion, to the understanding of eternity. If we look at quantum physics, it explains that past, present, and future coexist simultaneously. And this is also why I distinguish the practice from the actual outcome of the practice. It's not that the practice is about making things or objects, it's movement in itself. And that is related to Toltecayotl, which can be translated as the dialogue between head and heart. Toltecayotl is a group of complex ideas explaining the existence of the universe, life, and consciousness. And when the Franciscans had trouble being able to translate the idea of art, they actually translated, they used Toltecayotl. But Toltecayotl is not really art, it's much more complex, and it has little to do with the definition of art, but rather should be understood as relishing the fight. This is a phrase that Kristen Buick has repeated many times. She's a board member, scholar, etc. For those of you who don't are not familiar with her work, and we'll be using some of her essays in that sense, which has become Archetopia's method, relishing the fight. And this is the connection that I make between the joy of making. Think about how the practice of making, how we engage, whether it's embroidery, whether it's performance, whether it's painting, whether it's selecting color, whatever it is that we do in our practice, abstract us from this horrific world. I always mention that this world is absolutely terrible. We are born and we are unwelcome into this world, even if we had loving families or we have loving families. But life, in contrast to the world, is an incredible song worth singing. And that's where we also intersect the notion of rhythm, meaning the rhythm between the joy of making and what Audre Lorde's notion of anger describes is what we're going to be thinking about in terms of our practices. Anger is a product of grief. because of the distortion among peers. I'm going to keep thinking about that. So rather than thinking about seeing as truth, we think about seeing in the dark. Ending the optical regime of settler colonialism means making its way of seeing and forming time-space visible. According to Nicolas Mirzo, perceiving beyond and in opposition to settler colonialism is what he refers to as seeing in the dark. This darkness represents a temporal and spatial realm beyond the reach of constant surveillance. Engaging with this space enables a shift from dissociation to connection. To see in the dark is to challenge and make visible what is obscured by the dominant white settler colonial perspective. The in quotes dark exists beyond the constrained scope of white sight, which is structured by single point perspective and other visual technologies, most notably exemplified by today by the drone, as we had seen. And here I question the dark. And what you're seeing on the left, it's an image of my most recent exhibition. I'm using the idea of the obsidian mirror, which was introduced into Europe in the early 1600s and transforms Europe in multiple ways. It's also, you'll see a coat made with indigo. So I'll explain the piece in a moment. So um, taking this as a metaphor, what is revealed in the dark encompasses various moments across time and space. The past, the concealed, the invisible, what endures and what emerges. This darkness is both personal and political. What is dark for us individually can be complex, often involving aspects we may wish to forget or that have been repressed. Seeing in the dark is challenging because it demands us to engage with both of these layers. As the radical thinker and art critic John Berger once said, in the dark, in quotes, reality is not a given. Visual activism today involves searching through the debris, whether it's fragments of words, found video, or physical objects. It requires what Berger described as the in quotes undefeated despair he witnessed in Palestine. Remember, too, that fascism aims to instill this defeated despair in its opponents above all else. To see in the dark is to look beyond the constraints of the kill box and the limited scope of vision controlled by white sight. It is the way the watch perceive, not the watchers, in those moments beyond the reach of surveillance. This perspective aligns with what Black Studies theorist Simone Brown describes as, in quotes, dark surveillance, where the watch monitor the watchers, particularly those marked as Black or any other minoritized individual. Seeing in the dark or community. Seeing in the dark is an act of solidarity, a way to understand how colonialism is carried out. And I can go back to the image in a moment. I don't want to extend too much because I also want to leave space for questions. So we'll finish the presentation and I can go back. So rhythms as survival. Fred Mountain is an American scholar and poet whose work explores the Black radical tradition, focusing on how Black music, performance, and everyday life generate forms of resistance, community, and freedom. In books like In the Break, he describes uh, fugitivity and improvisations as ways Black life escapes domination, creating new rhythms, languages, and possibilities of being together. Fred Mountain understands rhythm as more than a musical element. It's a mode of fugitivity, a way of moving through and away from the systems of domination. Um, for Mountain, rhythm, and particularly improvisation, is deeply social. He writes that improvisation is the model practice of our inhabitation of the earth. It is the broken earth we inhabit, and the broken world is rhythmic. This statement reflects how communities, under conditions of historical rupture and violence, generate new ways of living together, improvising care, solidarity, and joy in a damaged world. Mountain pushes the concept of rhythms beyond culture or aesthetics into ontology, the realm of being itself. Rhythm is not only an expression of life, but a fundamental way of existing in the world. Formed by history of enslavement, displacement, and resistance, it manifests in bodily gestures, breath, sound, and affective bonds that exceed rational, linear, in quotes, white notions of time and identity. In this sense, rhythm is how we move and relate, creating bonds and temporalities that cannot be contained by dominant social frameworks. The practice of everyday life. Um, in the practice of everyday life, Michel Desserteau explained that strategies belong to the powerful states, institutions, and corporations that establish structures, rules, and boundaries to organize space, time, and behavior. Strategies are planned from a position of authority. They are meant to define how life is ordered and who controls it. Tactics, on the other hand, are the art of the weak, the improvised, often fleeting actions of those who lack institutional power but still navigate, inhabit, and subtly alter the spaces imposed upon them. Deserto writes that tactics are, include ingenious ways in which the oppressed make use of the space imposed upon them. End of quote. They are acts of cunning and adaptation, operating within the cracks of dominant systems rather than trying to dismantle them outright. Tactics borrow from what already exists, using it differently, resignifying it, or making it serve other needs than those intended by the structures of power. Tactics reminds us that resistance does not always look like grand revolutions. It can be small, everyday, clever disruptions that reclaim agency in space designed to control or exclude. They open up moments of freedom, however brief, in which other ways of being together and imagining the world can appear. And this is how we need to associate our practices. They are always based on tactics. And this is the function of intuition. Intuition is a form of moving that we learn since we're very little, and it can be traced all the way to the decisions we make in our own practices. So, interdependency. Without community, there is no liberation, only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between an individual and her oppression. But community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist. Interdependency is the way to become free, which allows the I to be, not in order to be used, but in order to be created. This is a difference between the passive be and the active being, which is what we're doing, challenging the I, the notion of place, and even the idea of freedom. Within the interdependence of mutual, non dominant differences lies that security which enables us to descend into the chaos of knowledge and return with true visions of our future, along with the concomitant power to effect those changes which can bring that future into being. This is from Audre Lorde's famous piece, The Master Tools. Elsa Barkley Brown, which also uses Audre Lorde's work, reimagines and emphasizes that community isn't a fixed structure, but a continuous creation sustained by daily acts, friendship, organizing, storytelling that weave Black life together, that weave our lives together. This is what we're doing through this program. She writes that community is possible only when gombo yaya, everybody talks at once, rather than conventional consensus, is given full reign. And we're going to intersect that with our practices. Through this lens, community becomes a dynamic, multivocal process. It is created and recreated through interaction, through listening and responding, through recognizing that no life stands apart from the lives of others. Interdependency for Brown is not a matter of choice, it is the fabric of our social world. What matters is how we engage with that fabric, whether we ignore its complexity or whether we embrace its multiple rhythms, allowing creativity, solidarity, and justice to emerge from the interplay of our differences. And I want to finish the presentation with these two quotes. Violence does not consist so much in injuring and annihilating persons as in interrupting their continuity. That is what that's what body is, making them play roles in which they no longer recognize themselves, making them betray not only commitments but their own substance, making them carry out actions that will destroy every possibility for action. And this is the core of um, Emmanuel Levinas' thoughts. And we can refuse infernal alternatives and stay with the trouble. As one slogan puts it, in quotes, we are the offsprings of the witches they did not burn. I want to stop right there so that we can have time for questions. This session has been recorded so that you also have access to it. So I know it's a little window, maybe a big window, to look into these concepts and start thinking about them. So you will have access to the slides. I will also upload the presentation there with the video so that you can also look into my notes. And I want to open the space for any questions you might have in terms of the idea, anything that is not clear, anything that you want me to go back to.
I have a question. Can you connect the witch hunts to rhythm for me, just like very explicitly?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
The reason why the term that we actually have to use is how the Huns crafted the witches.
Okay.
And these women, because frequently the argument that we see, first of all, this theme of the witch hunts is understudied on purpose. You know, there's new waves of scholars who are looking at it, but historically, being the longest process of extermination, there should be a lot of information which there is not. Constantly, these archives, because these were trials, legal procedures, are being burned. You will hear that in this town, this library was burnt, and of course, the whole archive is gone. And then here, and that has been systematically over centuries. We also have to think about how it's not really because the argument, it seems to be that women were powerful because of the knowledges they possessed. Yes and no, because historically, women are not regarded as producers of knowledge. And it's also true that in the process of the witch hunts, not all women were actually burnt. Only specific kinds of women, only specific communities, only, and it has to do with these forms of knowledge that were communal. And that meant other ways of moving. So one of the key aspects to understand the hunts is that these women had already established limits between the exploitation of bodies, people rather than bodies, and the land. And that is also associated with how they transfer knowledge to each other. Now, the core of all of this is that communal is absolutely opposite to property. If it's communal, it's not property. And if it's not property, it cannot be hoarded. It cannot be preserved, prevent the sharing in that sense.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Yep. Other questions? Other comments? Yes, Liz.
Um, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Good. Just a quick comment. I'm
Mhm,
thinking about rhythm.
mhm.
I see this, well, I understand this as being strongly connected, well, completely related to heartbeat. And I kind of understand that through music, but also through seeing colors, the way the colors link within an image. There's a kind of pulse there, which brings you back to heartbeat. And in music, there's a kind of, it's not always there, particularly in contemporary music, but it's almost like there's a well, it brings you to repetition. There's a circularity which is almost visible in some music that I relate to strongly, and all that implies. Do other people see that?
Yes, I mean, I can answer for myself, not that I want to get ahead of anyone, but I was looking at a text yesterday that actually describes how images also have sounds, also have rhythms, also have,
Mm.
so yes, it is also to understand how repetition is connected to eternity, and that's how we make ourselves present with each other. And it's also to expand and to challenge the notion of human. When you say heartbeat, it's the energy that we all share with other species. It's not only heart, I mean, of course, it's heartbeat for how we understand ourselves as humans, but it's also connected to other species, that vibration in which we share that energy that makes us be alive.
Yes.
Mhm. Thank you, Liz. Other notes, other questions, other comments?
Hello?
Mhm. Yes.
Yes. I love the comment communities without property, because here in the Western world we have a lot of communities, but property is still very important. Uh, how is it there? Do you have community without property?
Yes, we could. I mean, it's two things. We are all colonized subjects, and that means that we are tied to this driving rationale, which property has become. But when we have these kinds of spaces, we can establish systems in which generosity could expand. For instance, we call them teaching moments, when you ask a question and everyone learns, or when you answer and respond and I also learn. Um, it's tied to understanding that when we think about politics, when we think about, and that is in terms of injustice, not necessarily in terms of democracy, no one is free until everyone is free. So we have to constantly challenge how we figure out that relationship to each other without allowing property to filter that, to mediate that. Which is in the end the challenge is what we have to, one of the ideas that we always have to think about is how animals approach anything with an open relationship, while we humans tend to approach it with a notion of greed or even property, or how we can modify that. I think the best example, I found it from a TV show, Hannibal. And in one of the dialogues, he says, we inherited from our animal ancestors feelings. That was a gift to us. However, humanity gave itself the gift of cruelty. That's the difference. That's the difference of how we center property in that sense. Mhm. Other questions, other comments? I know this is a lot. It's not that we have to comprehend everything at once. I try to pack as much as possible as an introduction, and that includes challenging the ways in which we see. That includes the notion of body as something real, material, and physical that we are led to believe we have, which is constructed through the history of the witch hunts all the way to um, the colonization of the Americas, and also then intersecting it with the notion of rhythm. So we're going to spend time thinking about these concepts through the readings so that there's also connections, there's also landing on the practices. As we move along, we're going to have these individual sessions with each one of you, landing it, grounding it more than landing it, grounding it in the practice. The practice is always about rhythms and vocabularies that we use, and we're going to expand that following each one of you, your own intuition in that sense. So you will lead the way, and we will be providing the different methods of the readings to be able to identify these different elements of the practice in that sense. Any questions about the presentation so far?
It was a lot, but thank you so much. I have to get it.
Process. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
I have. Oh,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you could give an example or two of what seeing in the dark might look like in practice.
Yes. Seeing in the dark, and I can go back to the slide of the work. Seeing in the dark it has several layers. First is to understand that we have to tap into the terrible histories that we share. That means that uncomfortable space in which we have to acknowledge we are connected through these histories of extermination. Mirzev describes it as the act in which, and I think it's John Berger actually, and Mirzev cites him, in which we touch the bare ground and we feel the destruction. We feel the rubble. As we touch the rubble, we have to figure out how to rebuild something. But as we touch the rubble, we also find each other. And that's to understand that before sight, touching came as a sense. As I touch each one of you, or as we find each other in this space in the dark, we also have to learn how to move in concert together. And that's not through symmetry, it can include, but it's not the linear way, rather the asymmetry in which we understand and accept that we can understand, we don't know each other, we can't understand each other, even if we have spent our lives together, but we are still obligated to move in concert. So in the piece that you see on the left, I'm thinking about these ideas. And in the early, when the expansion and the invasion of Tenochtitlan happened, many of the objects were actually raided and then ended up in Europe being sold to different markets. And one of these objects is the dark mirror that you see in the center of this piece, which ended up in the British Museum. And it's the mirror. I'll make the story short so that it doesn't take too long. John Dee, which was the advisor of Elizabeth I, ends up buying it. And there's a connection there between Elizabeth I and Moctezuma II from Tenochtitlan. From there, these technologies of mirror, these ideas of mirror, start changing the culture of Europe very rapidly, all the way to finding, they become so important as a device in which you reflect yourself and have to think about ethics. And you see it in children's stories such as Snow White, and you find it in medieval manuscripts, and it's also a European tradition that intersects with this idea. So this piece is based on the portrait of Elizabeth I, the Armada portraits, in which Spain was trying to invade England, and it fails, and it's an imperial imperial portrait in which Elizabeth is pointing at the Americas as the greed that she has to expand her empire. So we see in this piece that it's actually framed by a silver leaf. And I can post better images on the classroom so that you have access to them. And the silver leaf is connected to the extraction of silver in the Americas. I superimpose an engraved print that is based on a Titian painting of the rapture of Europa. If you remember, what gives name to the continent of Europe is this story in which this girl is kidnapped by Zeus, who transforms itself into a bull and rapes her. And that sets the tone to every history that we share. So then the next layer of the piece is the lace of the portrait of Elizabeth I from this Armada portrait. And then the last layer are these feathers, ostrich feathers, with a tiny decoration of pearls and gemstones, which is taken also out of the portrait. And what we see in this portrait as well is how the Tudors, who were very savvy in understanding images and the power of images, incorporated all these different materials and ideas and elements from different so-called empires to construct the idea of the British Empire. And that includes feathers from Africa, of course, but also pearls from the Caribbean, but also gems that are extracted from mines. So the piece is made so that the audience can see themselves reflected in the mirror. But the quality of the dark mirror makes it strange, to say the least, because you can fully see yourself reflected in the mirror, but you can't ignore that you're seeing yourself, but also through the framework of the British Empire, but also through the ideas of colonialism. So what I try to do in my work, and it doesn't mean that is successful in that sense, is just to think about the questions that intersect with my personal experience and how these questions are connected to silences that historically are framed, that historically these stories are ignored. You know, this connection to just to think that Moctezuma II, which is the Tlatoani, the authority, had been reflected in the same mirror that Elizabeth reflected, creates a marriage that is impossible to separate the Americas from Europe. And that explains how our histories are intertwined from the process of extraction. You know, the piece has also other layers, the Indigo Code, and that's connected to the Grand Tour, etc. But the idea is to figure out those moments in which these histories seem to be so distant, you know, so separated from an ocean, but in fact they're linked together to the point we can't really separate ourselves from how we share these experiences from where we are actually positioned.